The house smelled like cinnamon and roast. Lights blinked soft against the window glass. People had their stories ready. Their laughter sounded practiced. I walked in with my coat wet from the snow and felt the room breathe around me. They noticed me like they notice weather, only when it affects the view. Can you imagine stepping into a place that treats you like a detail? My sister smiled like a stage light. Her voice cut across the table like glass. This, she said, with that careful sweetness, is the failure of our family. Forks stopped. Conversation thinned. Someone laughed because it was what they'd always done. I did not move. I did not speak. But someone else did. He set his fork down. The sound was soft. It landed in the middle of the room. Interesting, he said. That single word shifted the air. It was small. It was precise. My name is Serenity Hale. For years I lived at the edges, where light thinned and voices muffled. I learned to carry plates without clatter. To keep small. To survive without being seen. Have you ever been made into someone else's cautionary tale at a family table? Tonight, everything would quietly tilt. The kind of tilt that does not scream, but rearranges a life. He wasn't dramatic. He was factual. He showed the screen. Evidence. Metadata. Access logs. Can you picture the careful click of a tablet illuminating a living room? The words he chose did not shout. They placed a fact on the table. You're fired, he said. Not dramatic. Not meant to humiliate. Meant to correct. Meant to be true. The relatives shifted like actors thrown off script. Silence wrapped the house like an old coat. This is not a story about vengeance that melts into noise. This is a quiet, measured reclaiming. I will tell you how I collected what was mine. How I watched the traces, gathered proofs, and decided to stop being the quiet witness. Can you imagine starting over with only the weight of what was taken, and the records that prove it? Listen close. There are small betrayals here that look like family. And small truths that look like rescue. Soft engagement hook, have you ever held evidence in your hands and felt it change the shape of the room? The first clear memory is the way forks stopped midair. A practiced smile. A room set to exact pitch. My sister pulled her boyfriend toward me as if she were shepherding a scene. She placed the line like a stage director. This is the failure of our family. My parents laughed as if tradition demanded it. They had learned the timing. The recoil. The applause. I stood in the doorway and felt the walls already know how to receive me, small, apologetic, easily moved aside. You learn manners early when your place is limited. I learned to be unnoticeable. To stand where light thinned. To make myself background. There were dinners where I learned patience the hard way, plate after plate passing, always leaving me the cold corner. I did not complain. Complaint invited lectures. Don't be greedy, Diana said once, soft and cutting. It sounded like instruction. Do you remember being told to be practical instead of daring? That's how it was with us. My wins were folded away. My sketches, my acceptances, simply disappeared into polite silences. I got an acceptance into an art program once. I came home elated. Diana read my letter carefully, then placed it on the counter with a thin, decent voice. Leia has a dance that day. We can't drive all over town. The letter never made it further. It went to the trash. 2 days later a new costume arrived for Leia. That was the rhythm. Money shifted like a tide. Mine ebbed away, and their certainty swelled. It wasn't called favoritism. It was called support. A kind of family logic that kept me small. Believing it made the house less cruel, easier to live in. But belief can be a soft kind of blindness. At work I learned a different quiet. I learned how to unspool a concept until it looked like less than it was. I learned to catalog, index, and protect what I made. But at the agency, the silence had a price. My concept file, Sweat and Nights and Fixes, vanished from the shared folder one day. In its place was a version renamed and polished. Leia's initials signed the corner like a new signature on an old painting. You ever feel a room rearrange itself so you're out of the frame? That's what happened. I stood behind a half-open door while they rehearsed the final cut. They told the story again. Serenity dropped out. She crumbles under pressure. People chuckled like they'd been given the cue. Adrian didn't join the laughter. He looked at me instead, once, and that tiny look did something to the air. It didn't fix anything. But it noticed. And noticing is the first quiet step toward change. That night I opened access logs. There it was, her username. The timestamp. The deletion. The upload. Clean as a ledger. The intern whose shoulders made him shrink told me what he'd seen. I didn't react at first. Old patterns make the heart slow its pace. You wait because you've long perfected the art of being overlooked. But the logs don't lie. They give you a map. So I started a map. Copies of emails, budgets, transfers she had initiated. Little things that, when arranged, told the same story, a pattern that had been called care. I printed receipts. I saved screenshots. I built a folder called Documents. It felt like building a small fortress out of facts. Not dramatic. Very administrative. Cold, actually. And precise. You learn in that quiet how method can become power. Small administrative acts, copying, saving, timestamping, were the kind of tools injustice couldn't argue with. That night, I packed them. And I walked to the old studio above the laundromat where I'd once kept my freelance drives. The machines downstairs were a soft, constant drum, familiar and oddly comforting. Inside the drawer, wrapped in an old scarf, were early drives. Old sketches. Campaign seeds. The bones of what later became other people's headlines. I plugged them in and watched the folders bloom. The work was mine. It had only been given a new, louder name. I took what I needed. Not out of spite. Out of necessity. It felt like reclaiming a garden you had planted and found a neighbor harvesting. Can you imagine sitting alone in an empty studio watching the city lights slide? Snow began to fall outside. Quiet, steady. I opened a spreadsheet, clients, campaigns, budgets, hours logged. The ledger grew longer than I'd thought. The math of my life fit into columns. That simple list translated fatigue into fact. And facts can be shown. They can be placed on a table and watched change the faces around it. Soft engagement hook, what would you do if you found the proof that someone had rewritten your life on their own terms? I returned to the office with a folder that felt heavier than paper. Not because of weight, but because it contained a different kind of currency, proof. Evidence speaks in a voice that cannot be softened into excuses. It cannot be re-scripted by sympathy. Adrian watched the screen like someone reading a map. He saw the metadata the way a mechanic reads gears. He didn't dramatize. He cataloged. The access logs, the transfers, the signatures, each item a small pulse of truth. He said, simply, HR needs this. Legal needs this. The board needs to know. You ever notice how truth often arrives with a clipboard? It isn't fireworks, it's a form. And forms can be unignorable. We spent hours assembling the packet. Each page a stitch in an argument that could not be laughed away. He asked if I wanted to deliver it. I thought about how I've learned silence can be comfortable and also a prison. I wanted the small dignity of being present, not to gloat, but to stop letting the record be rewritten without me. Christmas dinner that year felt like the end of an old season. I walked into the room late on purpose. I let my coat melt water onto the tile. They had their scripts. Leia performed them, small triumphs, practiced lines. She introduced me with that old cruel flourish. I sat at the edge of the table where light thinned. My hands rested on the packet. The paper made a faint sound when I shifted. It was like setting a heartbeat on the table. He set his fork down and said, quietly, interesting. Then, you're fired. The sentence was small. The consequence was enormous. He brought the evidence up on screen, the living room filled with digital proof, files, timestamps, logs. I watched as their constructed story collapsed, not with a shout but with a slide. Leia's face moved through confusion, denial, then the particular shrinking of someone watching the stage dissolve. What I remember is the smallness of gestures. Richard's face tightened. Diana opened her mouth and closed it, there was nowhere to put a prepared barbed line. The cousins shifted. Relatives who had learned when to laugh did not know now whether to pretend they had not heard. Have you seen a house lose its script? It is a strange quiet. As if the room forgot its cues. The board received the packet, HR processed a termination, and Adrian's tablet brightened the living room with slides that kept unfurling. My portfolio appeared, the campaigns with my fingerprints on every slide. The raw files. The same bones Leia had tried to claim. The transaction records showed transfers, budget approvals signed without authority. The pattern was not a single theft, but a long habit that looked like care until you lined it up next to receipts. There was no grand speech. No dramatic collapse. The truth functioned like clean machinery. Adrian's voice stayed calm, the facts were the force. He didn't punish theatrically. He corrected administratively. He chose truth over family comfort. I'm choosing the truth, he said. That was the moment the house had no script for. They had always relied on performance, and performance usually had a predictable applause. This time the applause did not come. I sat there, hands folded. My silence had been trained for survival. But in that silence, on that night, it felt like authority. Not triumph, the steady click of doors closing on old patterns. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The evidence did its work. Their stories unspooled in front of them, and there was nothing left to rehearse. Afterward, I left the house the way I had arrived, stepping out into cold that cut clean. The world was oddly merciful in that way, rain or snow that covers and reveals. Seattle felt different not because the city changed but because I stood in it differently. Adrian helped set up a new office, not as a favor but because he understood and respected the difference between survival and living. We kept it simple, a wood desk, a soft chair, sketches pinned where they could be seen. The work that felt heavy in the old house became light when it no longer had to be defended. Distance gave me a new rhythm. It wasn't an instant miracle. It was the slow relearning of what it meant to have a place that did not shrink you. I cooked my first dinner for friends a year later. We packed extra meals and walked them to a shelter. The night smelled of salt and kindness. When I sat down later at my small table, I took the best portion. No one told me I didn't deserve it. No one measured my worth against someone else's appetite. That small plate tasted like a life stitched back into itself. Soft engagement hook, at what point does quiet collecting of facts become the clearest form of courage? Reclaiming what is yours rarely comes with fanfare. It comes with details, invoices, timestamps, signatures. Those small things are the scaffolding of justice in a quiet life. I learned to appreciate how administrative things can topple a story others have told about you. The process was not only about proving theft. It was about understanding the shape of a life that had been shifted. The payments I found. Transfers she had made in my name. Budgets signed without approval. Years of small erasures. Each line on a spreadsheet was an old absence made visible. When you begin to name an absence, it stops being a fog and becomes a map. I did not set out to punish. I wanted to stop being a silent witness to my own erasure. The work of assembling the files felt clinical. Hours at a desk, printing, scanning, formatting. Adrian sat with me during the assembly, his presence steady. He had seen people try to perform their way out of facts before. Facts were harder to rewrite. He offered help without pity. There is a difference, I learned, between pity and straightforward respect. Respect keeps the dignity intact. Pity breaks it. When the evidence landed on the board's table, I felt neither vindictive joy nor hollow relief. I felt a steadiness. The kind of calm that comes when something heavy has been set down. The family had to reorient. For a moment, the abstract ideas of loyalty and support were forced to be concrete. Payment traces. Signatures. Email threads. You could, for the first time, follow the money and see where attention was misdirected. The pattern, when shown plainly, loses its ability to be gentle. What looked like care now looked like a long habit of taking. Leia's confusion turned into defense. She tried the old lines, blame the overwhelmed sister, call me inconsistent, tell the room that she only tried to help. But the slides kept advancing. Each click was a reveal. Each document another small door opening. There is something oddly surgical about a slideshow that tells the truth. It does not shout. It points. And when the pointing is precise, the room has to answer. My parents had no script for this. They'd been dining on rehearsed cruelty for years, mistaking it for tradition. Now there was a new rhythm, legal language, HR procedures, boardroom actions. The comfortable roles they had assigned me dissolved without ceremony. They could not simply laugh and continue. There was settlement now, though not necessarily reconciliation. There was accounting. And accounting demands different behaviors than storytelling. After everything, I did not want to burn the bridge. I wanted a life that did not require constant apology. I wanted to live in a way where my work belonged to me. So I moved. The apartment was small, a plant on the sill, rain against the glass. I kept my portfolio visible in a way I never could before. It was not an act of showmanship. It was a quiet settling. A decision that my work could be seen and held and protected. At the agency, things changed slowly. Adrian and I organized the archive, made sure credits were corrected, clients were informed of true authorship. The staff learned that systems matter, access logs matter. Policy matters. When you make it harder to hide behind family narratives, you change incentives. People begin to think as if fairness has a structure. That is useful. That is quiet revolution. 1 year later, I cooked for friends on Christmas Eve. We packed extra meals and walked them to a shelter nearby. The night had the kind of cold that wakes you up. When I sat at my table later with a small, honest plate, I realized something. Silence had been my survival method. But silence could also be a weapon if you used it to build rather than to hide. I had used it to collect. I used it to protect what was mine. And in the end, that felt like authority. Soft engagement hook. Have you ever slowly built a case with small, precise steps until the whole story changed? There is a moment, after the facts are laid bare, when people must decide what to do with the new truth. Some cling tighter to the old story because it comforts them. Some shift and find a different way. My family mostly recoiled. The applause they once saved for Leia quieted because there was nothing left for it to hold. The machinery of truth had rendered their performance untenable. I did not stand in the ruins shouting. I simply kept working. The slow methodical tasks of rebuilding do not make for good gossip. They do not make for dramatic headlines. But they do what matters, they place things where they belong. I corrected credits, I answered for my pieces, I returned emails with clear authorship. I fixed ledgers. I told clients the truth. It did not come in fireworks. It came in steady, administrative insistence. The world bent, quietly, to facts. There were consequences for them. Audits. Questions from relatives who suddenly had to choose where their loyalty lay. Relationship lines shifted. Some people left the frame. Others stayed, watching the slow reassembly of a life they had long taken for granted. I learned that consequences are not always theatrical. Sometimes they are just the small, grinding adjustments that force a new equilibrium. Seattle was not an escape so much as a classroom where I relearned how to belong to myself. I had a small apartment, a plant, and a desk where sketches pinned could breathe. Adrian helped set up the new office because he respected the difference between survival and living. He wasn't rescuing me, he was recognizing a collaborator. That kind of recognition is a quiet but powerful thing. It rewrites how you imagine the future. One winter evening, I took the packet, the documents, the receipts, the long list of corrections, and I let them exist as what they were, a record. I did not carry them like a trophy. I carried them like a ledger. A ledger that said simply, this is where my work was. I can put it down now. That was relief in a small package. Not vindication but clarity. Not revenge but restoration. When you stop asking for the applause you were denied, you begin to claim the portions of life you were taught to abandon. On a quiet night, a year after that Christmas, I cooked a modest dinner with friends. We walked meals to people who needed them more. I sat at my own table and chose the best portion. Nobody told me I didn't deserve it. Nobody measured my worth against someone else's appetite. It was a small, ordinary victory. A life unbent. Soft engagement hook. If you had to gather the records of your life, what would the first document say? And now, if this story reached you in the dark, know this, silence can be chosen. Silence can be the place you collect evidence. Silence can also be the doorway you open when you are ready. I used silence to build a case. I used the case to change the story. I did not set out to punish. I set out to stop being erased. That quiet work changed everything. If this story touched you, if you recognize the grief of being made small or the slow comfort of rebuilding, please do something small for me at the end, like, comment, and subscribe. It helps these quiet stories find the people who need them most.